In the autumn of 331 BCE, a Persian king stood on a plain he had personally ordered flattened and looked at the army coming toward him. He had done everything right. He had chosen the location carefully after losing the last battle on terrain that had worked against him. He had brought engineers to level the ground so nothing would interrupt his cavalry charge. He had assembled somewhere between 2,000 and 25,000 soldiers. Historians still argue the exact number, but even the conservative estimates are staggering. He had war elephants, scythed chariots, cavalry from a dozen different nations, and at the center of his formation, the soldiers that had protected the Persian throne for 2 centuries. Coming toward him was a Macedonian king, 25 years old, with 47,000 men. Darius III smiled. There's something almost painful about that smile in retrospect. Not because he was foolish, he wasn't, but because he was operating on a completely different understanding of what was about to happen than the young man walking toward him across that dust. To understand what that difference was, you have to go back about 200 years and understand what Persia actually represented in the ancient world. Cyrus the Great started with one province in what is now southwestern Iran in 550 BCE. Within a generation, he had taken the Median Empire, absorbed Lydia on the western coast of modern Turkey, and walked into Babylon so peacefully that the city essentially handed him the keys. His successors kept going. Egypt, parts of Greece, territory reaching east toward India. By the time the empire reached its full size, it covered more of the Earth's surface than anything before it. An empire that large is not held together by soldiers alone. It runs on administration, on roads, on systems of taxation and tribute that function across dozens of languages and cultures and climates. Persia had built all of that. It was genuinely sophisticated, more sophisticated in some ways than the civilizations that eventually replaced it. But the part that the rest of the ancient world knew most intimately was the Immortals. 10,000 soldiers. The number never changed, because the moment one was lost, another stepped forward to fill the position. From a distance, on a battlefield, watching this unit absorb casualties without visibly shrinking, it produced a specific psychological effect in enemies that went beyond ordinary fear. They looked like something that the normal rules didn't apply to. They weren't supernatural, of course. They were the product of an institution that selected, trained, and maintained soldiers with a consistency that nobody else in the ancient world had matched. These men had trained since childhood: horseback riding, archery, hand-to-hand combat, formation discipline. They wore scale armor that caught the light in a way that made them look almost otherworldly in desert conditions. They carried composite bows sophisticated enough to punch through armor at significant distance, and they knew how to use them. For about 200 years, that combination of reputation and reality made them the most feared military force anywhere. Then Greece happened to them, and it happened 3 separate times. The first time was Marathon in 490 BCE, where the Athenians made a tactical decision that still feels counterintuitive. They charged. Instead of waiting for Persian arrows to reduce their numbers, they ran at the Persian line at full speed and closed the distance before the archers could fully do their work. The Persian center collapsed under the shock of it. The second time was Thermopylae in 480 BCE, which is the engagement most people know, though the part they know is usually the heroic Greek last stand, rather than what it meant for the Immortals specifically. Xerxes sent his best soldiers, the Immortals, into a narrow pass in the mountains against a force of Greeks who had gone there specifically to die and intended to take as many Persians with them as possible. The pass was so narrow that Persian numbers meant almost nothing. The Immortals attacked for 2 days. They were turned back every time. The finest soldiers in the world could not get through a gap held by men who had already decided the outcome didn't matter to them personally. The pass eventually fell because a Greek man from a nearby village showed the Persians a path around it, not because the Immortals solved the problem themselves. The third time was Plataea in 479 BCE. Open ground, full armies, a genuine test without the geographic complications of Thermopylae. The Immortals fought with everything they had: The Greek phalanx, with its interlocking shields and long spears and emphasis on formation discipline, proved to be a system that the Immortals couldn't break. The Persian army eventually scattered. 3 invasions of Greece, 3 failures. Persia survived all 3, which is worth pausing on. The empire didn't collapse after Plataea. It kept functioning for another 150 years, collecting tribute, maintaining roads, administering its vast territories. The Immortals kept guarding the throne. The setbacks against Greece were real, but they didn't break the machine. What they did was crack something that matters more than territory, the assumption of invincibility. Alexander had read all of this. That's the thing that tends to get buried under the drama of his campaigns. Before he crossed into Asia in 334 BCE, he had spent years with these accounts. He knew Herodotus. He understood what Marathon revealed about Persian vulnerability to aggressive shock tactics. He understood what Thermopylae revealed about the relationship between formation and terrain. He understood what Plataea demonstrated about what happened when Persian cavalry couldn't flank, and the infantry had to hold against a disciplined Greek line. He arrived in Asia with 47,000 men, a force that looked absurdly small against what Persia could field. But he arrived knowing something that Darius didn't know he knew. His first engagement at the Granicus River, he won immediately. Then came Issus in 333 BCE, where Darius appeared personally on a narrow coastal plain with a far larger army, and the terrain once again negated the Persian numerical advantage. Alexander's cavalry broke through the Persian left flank and drove toward Darius himself. Darius left the battlefield. With his chariot and without his family, his wife, mother, and daughters were left behind and captured. Alexander housed them in royal quarters, addressed them according to their rank, and ensured they were treated exactly as their status required. When Darius's mother apparently initially mistook Hephaestion for Alexander and prostrated herself before the wrong man, Alexander is said to have told her that Hephaestion was also Alexander, meaning he is also to be treated as a king would be treated. Whether or not that exact exchange happened, the policy was clear and deliberate. These were the family of a king, and they would be treated accordingly. Every Persian administrator and nobleman who heard about that treatment understood something about what Alexander intended. Not the erasure of Persia, but something more complicated and more ambitious. Darius retreated east and spent 2 years rebuilding. He was not passive about it. He recruited broadly, gathered cavalry from across the empire, and thought carefully about the mistakes at Issus. The narrow ground had been the problem. It had prevented his numbers from meaning anything. So he chose Gaugamela specifically because it offered the opposite. A wide, flat plain with room to deploy his entire army simultaneously, room for his cavalry to sweep around the edges, room for his chariots to build up speed before hitting the Macedonian line. He had engineers level the ground to remove any irregularities that might slow the charge. He had redesigned his scythed chariots with longer blades. He had more men than Alexander had encountered at Issus, far more. The night before the battle, Alexander's general Parmenion suggested attacking at night. The logic was straightforward. Darkness would neutralize the Persian numerical advantage, reduce the battle to controlled chaos where discipline and unit cohesion mattered more than mass. It was a reasonable proposal. Alexander refused it. He said he would not steal his victory, and then he went to sleep. The detail about the sleeping has fascinated people who study this battle for a long time, and I think it's worth sitting with for a moment rather than just noting it and moving on. His officers were pacing outside his tent. Parmenion had to wake him before dawn. This was not a man who appeared to be experiencing anxiety about what was coming. The most plausible explanation, and it says something important about how Alexander operated, is that he had already worked through the battle completely in his mind. Not in a vague, optimistic way, but in the specific, detailed way that allowed him to identify where Darius's formation would create vulnerabilities as it moved, what the cavalry would do on the flanks, and where the gap would open. He had, in a meaningful sense, already fought the battle before the sun came up. What remained was execution. October 1st, 331 BCE. Darius sent his scythed chariots first. They were the opening statement, a demonstration of force designed to tear apart the Macedonian phalanx before the main engagement began. The chariots moved fast across the leveled ground, blades extended. Alexander's men had rehearsed for this. They opened lanes in their formation. The chariots passed through empty space. The drivers were surrounded and killed from behind. The main battle joined across a front that stretched for miles. In the center, the Immortals advanced against the Macedonian phalanx. These men had trained their entire lives, and they showed it. They didn't collapse, didn't panic, didn't break when they met resistance. They fought with discipline and gave ground only slowly, inflicting genuine casualties on the Macedonians, holding the line with everything they had been trained to do. There was nothing wrong with their soldiering. It was as good as it had ever been. But Alexander wasn't engaged in the center because he wanted to win there. As the Persian cavalry on the flanks surged forward to overlap the Macedonian line, trying to exploit the enormous difference in the width of the two armies, they pulled away from the center. It created a gap, a narrowing opening between the cavalry and the Immortals, and it lasted only for a moment before it would close again. Alexander had been watching for exactly this. He led his companion cavalry into that gap in a tight wedge formation, not going around the Persian army, but directly through it, driving toward the place in the formation where Darius was stationed. The companion cavalry were exceptionally well trained, and Alexander led from the front, which was not a ceremonial position. He was physically moving toward the Persian king across a battlefield involving hundreds of thousands of people. Darius watched it coming. At some point in those moments, watching the wedge of cavalry closing the distance, understanding what it meant if Alexander actually reached him, he turned his chariot and left. What happened after that was almost mechanical. Word spread through the Persian formation that the king had gone. The Immortals in the center were still fighting, still holding their ground, still functioning as the soldiers they had been trained to be, but the purpose of what they were doing had dissolved. An army fights for something, and when that something is removed mid-battle, the formation follows it. They broke. And then Alexander's forces pursued them across that flat, engineer-leveled plain for miles. The Persian Empire, 250 years old, the largest political entity the ancient world had ever produced, effectively ended that afternoon. What Alexander did afterward is the part of the story that tends to get less attention than the battle, but it might actually be more instructive. He walked into Persepolis and sat on the throne of Cyrus. He was king of kings. He had accomplished something that no one in Greek history had imagined was possible, and then he began keeping everything intact. Persian administrators kept their positions. Persian nobles were integrated into his court. The tax and tribute systems that Persia had developed over centuries continued operating. He recruited Persian soldiers into his army. He adopted Persian court dress, which caused real friction with his Macedonian generals, who had conquered Persia and expected to behave like conquerors. Alexander's position was essentially that destroying a sophisticated administrative system is easy, and rebuilding one from nothing is nearly impossible. Persia had roads, institutions, cultural legitimacy across enormous territories. The choice wasn't between Persian systems and Macedonian systems. It was between Persian systems and chaos. He was 32 years old when he died in Babylon in 323 BCE. His empire broke apart almost immediately among his generals. But the civilization he had absorbed rather than demolished kept going, through the Seleucid period, through the Parthians, through the Sasanians, for roughly 9 more centuries. Rome looked at what Alexander had done and drew the wrong lesson from it. What Rome saw was the conquest, the outnumbered army defeating the massive empire, the glory of it. What Rome didn't absorb, because Rome was not institutionally in the habit of studying enemies the way Alexander had studied Persia, was the methodology that made the conquest possible. Crassus was one of the 3 most powerful men in Rome in 53 BCE, alongside Caesar and Pompey. He was extraordinarily wealthy, politically influential, and aware that his 2 partners had military reputations that he lacked. Caesar had Gaul. Pompey had his eastern campaigns. Crassus wanted something comparable, and the Parthian territory to the east seemed like the opportunity. He marched 4,000 soldiers into Parthian territory without, apparently, a serious accounting of how Parthian warfare actually worked. The Parthians had spent generations developing a military approach that was specifically suited to their geography and resources, and which happened to be extremely effective against exactly the kind of army Rome fielded. Their core weapon was the horse archer, cavalry that attacked at range, retreated before the Romans could close to engage them, and then attacked again from a different angle. The Romans' shields and javelins were designed for close-quarters formation fighting. Against an enemy that simply refused to get close, they were much less useful. Behind the Parthian horse archers came supply camels carrying arrows. The attack could continue indefinitely. When Crassus's son led a cavalry charge to finally force a direct engagement, the Parthians retreated convincingly, drew the cavalry away from the main army, and then turned and surrounded them. The entire cavalry force was destroyed. The Parthians sent the young man's head back to his father. Crassus died trying to negotiate terms. Around 2,000 Romans were killed. Another 1,000 were captured. The Roman legion standards, objects that carried genuine religious significance in Roman military culture, never to be surrendered, were taken. Rome tried again under different commanders over the following 2 centuries. Mark Antony's Eastern campaign failed. Trajan made gains that couldn't be held and had to be abandoned. Valerian marched east in 260 CE and was captured alive on the battlefield, the only Roman emperor ever taken prisoner in combat. He spent the remainder of his life in Persia. Each failure followed roughly the same pattern. Roman commanders arrived with superior discipline, excellent infantry, and an assumption that what had worked everywhere else would work here. The Parthians and later the Sasanians declined to cooperate with that assumption. Rome never really solved the problem because Rome never seriously studied it the way it needed to be studied. The response to each failure was more soldiers and the same tactics, which is a comprehensible response but not an effective one. The thing that connects all of this, Alexander's success, Rome's repeated failures, the fall of the Immortals, the durability of Persian civilization, is something simpler than military strategy. Darius prepared for Gaugamela with genuine intelligence and effort. He chose the right terrain, assembled an overwhelming force, engineered solutions to specific tactical problems he had identified at Issus. By almost any reasonable analysis, he should have won. What he hadn't done was understand Alexander the way Alexander understood him. He knew his own strengths in great detail. He had spent very little time understanding the specific system his opponent had spent years building, the particular way the Macedonian cavalry and phalanx worked in combination, the tactical patience Alexander used to manufacture opportunities rather than force them, the psychological profile of a commander who could sleep soundly the night before a battle because he had already done his most important work. The Immortals lost not because they fought badly, but because the battle had been shaped before it started by someone who had studied them more carefully than they had studied themselves. Rome lost repeatedly in the East, not because Roman soldiers were inferior, they were among the finest soldiers in history, but because Roman commanders were unable or unwilling to update their understanding of what they were actually facing. Reputation accumulated from past victories is a real asset, but it is not the same thing as current understanding, and when those two things come apart, the reputation doesn't protect you. What made Alexander different wasn't courage. Darius had courage. It wasn't resources. Darius had vastly more. It wasn't even tactical creativity in the moment, though he had that. It was the years of work that happened before the battle. The reading, the analysis, the genuine effort to understand the enemy as a system rather than just as an obstacle. That is the part that doesn't get statues built for it. It happened in rooms, alone, with old accounts of battles that had been fought before Alexander was born. It was unglamorous and slow, and it mattered more than anything that happened on the plain of Gaugamela. Every generation seems to produce its version of the same story. The established power that knows itself well and has stopped genuinely learning, and the challenger who arrives knowing both. The established power usually has more. The challenger usually wins. Not always, but with a regularity that is hard to dismiss once you start looking for it. The sleeping wasn't arrogance. It was the rest of a man who had already done the work that actually decided the outcome. The battle itself, in a sense, was just the last step of something that had been completed long before dawn.